Hi, I'm Jackie Ferguson, Certified Diversity Executive, author of the Inclusive Language Handbook, podcast host for Diversity Beyond the Checkbox, and co-founder of the Diversity Movement. Today on the show, we're going to talk about why inclusive language is not about being politically correct, crossing the bridge between hiring quotas and recruiting top talent, and how to confront the hard questions about inclusion, including what privilege really is, and much more. Stay tuned.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Simply go to dovbaron.com. Now, I'm going to suppose that you are pro-diversity, pro-inclusion. However, there seems to be so many movements, so many groups, and if you support one, do you have to support them all? That was a question a lot of people are facing. Let's face it, part of supporting these groups often requires using the right language. There's words we're not supposed to say anymore and words that we need to say. And sometimes it can seem like what was okay yesterday is not okay today, and God knows if it will be all right tomorrow. Has it all gone too far? Again, I'm going to assume that you are a decent human being and you want to treat people right. You want to treat people with respect and have them feel comfortable. But where do you begin? If only there was some kind of a handbook with the language that was right and real for diversity. Maybe there is. Well, that's where we're going on the next two episodes. As always, we need your help in staying relevant. So please do us a favor. We really appreciate it. My team works very hard to make sure that you have exactly what you need, and we provide it to you for free. So we really appreciate it when you go over to wherever it is you tune into podcasts and do us a favor, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. If you are a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. And we are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. All right, let's dive in. At the beginning of the pandemic, you may remember that time, companies started to tighten their belts, tighten their budgets, because it was clearly going to be tough economic times. And one of the first things to go was the diversity and inclusion programs that they had. Fast forward to May 25th, 2020. You may remember that. George Floyd was murdered by police officers. And every company with a brain suddenly realized that diversity and inclusion programs that they'd cut needed to come back, and they needed to come back fast. But how much of that was actually real? And how much of that was for show? If we are going to genuinely support diversity, what will it really take? Well, let's find out together. Our guest for the next two episodes is Jackie Ferguson. Jackie Ferguson is an award-winning content creator, entrepreneur, author, speaker, and podcast host. Jackie spent the majority of her career across multiple facets of business, from startups to Fortune 500 companies. She is also the co-founder of Head of Content and Programming for the Diversity Movement, an organization that creates stronger business outcomes through strengthening culture and belonging. Jackie hosts the Diversity Beyond the Checkbox podcast and has been volunteering with and donating to equality organizations for more than 2 decades. Jackie is also a member of the Forbes Business Council and the National Diversity Council, and has been published by Forbes and Almanac and featured in several publications. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome Diversity Champion, Jackie Ferguson!
Hi, Dov. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here with you.
I'm looking forward to having you on. And, you know, this is a subject for me that has a lot of pointy edges. I'm sure it does for you too. A lot of pointy edges and a lot of things that really need to come to the fore. because I do believe that most leaders are decent human beings, but some of them are struggling. So let's jump in where we always like to jump in, which is, I talked about at the beginning that my company is about taking meaning into action. I think that too often we've tried to make meaning and emotion so clean that we've lost connection with people.
Mm-hmm.
What is the origin story of what gives your life meaning?
That is a deep question.
Thank you.
So
we've only got 4 or 5 hours to talk about that one, right?
Dov, I would have to say it was the birth of my daughter. That certainly is a life changer. And what I'll say about that is 2 days before she was born, my grandmother, who I absolutely adored, passed away.
Oh my goodness.
And so there was a major shift happening in my life. And it gave me time to really think about, what is it that I want to do? What's the legacy that I personally want to leave? And it took me some time to figure out what that was, a number of years, actually. And where I eventually got to was diversity and inclusion. And so I'd been volunteering and donating to equality organizations for, I would say since before my daughter was born. But because I come from a multiracial, multi-generational, multi-regional background, it was a natural shift for me to move into that. But ultimately, I want to make my daughter proud, and I want to leave a legacy for her to say, I can do anything that I want to do, anything that I work for. And my mom was a small part of that in the world.
So when you think about that, you're not 18 years old.
Right.
You came from a multiracial family. Is that correct? I want to make sure.
That's right. Yes.
Right. So
my father was white. My mother is Black. And in the 70s, that was not as common as it is today.
No. And you've also got First Nations people in you as well, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Right. So, like, as I said, you're Benetton, right? Changing your name to Benetton. Politically incorrect, but we're going to do it anyway. Right. So, you've got all these different things in you.
Yeah.
Do you think that being that inside your family gave you an understanding that wouldn't have existed if you were New Yorker, born in the same area you are? Sure. So regionally, it's exactly the same, but you'd have been a whitey.
Yeah. And what was interesting, Dov, is that everyone sees through their lens of experience, how they navigate the world. And it's unusual to have those different perspectives in the same house. So sitting around the dining table, we could talk about a current event, and my grandparents would have, who are from the South, would have one perspective. My father, who is white and grew up in the North in Pennsylvania, would have a different perspective. My mother would have another perspective. I would potentially have another perspective. And it's the same event. But because we all see through different experiences, it doesn't mean one is necessarily right or all right. It doesn't mean one is wrong or all wrong.
Right.
But it allowed me to really develop the skill of listening to perspectives that were different from my own. And I think that's really, Dov, where we have the disconnect. It's like we see through our lens, which is okay. All of us do that. But we're also not open to a different perspective based on a different life lived. And that's, I think, where we get it wrong.
And I think that that's exactly the point, is that for me, whatever you are, if you grew up in an all-white family or an all-Black family or an all-something family or a mixed family, or like I'm part of a very mixed family. You and I talked about that before. Yeah. But at the same time, I can't assume on either way, if it's all white or all Black or all something, that we hold the perspective. And I think that this is where the great challenge comes with diversity. And I'm going to push back a little bit around diversity because I think I'm voicing something that is very common. And that is, okay, we've got these quotas, we've got to have these people. All right. First of all, we got two issues here. Number one, why not the most qualified person? Mm-hmm. Who cares what color they are? Yeah. Right. And number two, does this person really represent their race? Or do they actually really represent their gender? Of course not. Yeah. Right? I don't represent every white Jewish immigrant. You don't represent every mixed race individual. I don't assume you'd think that.
That's right.
So that becomes the challenge, is that the person who's now in the position of power feels like, I don't know where to go because I had to hire this person because of diversity and quotas. Mm-hmm. This person's not the most qualified. I'm now supposed to take them on as representing, but they don't represent because I've got a black friend at home who doesn't think that at all. I mean, we've all seen the Trump rally with the black people who are positioned behind him.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
On purpose, right. Who are positioned behind him. And at the same time, we also know black liberals. So it's not fair to say that they represent. They're leveraged and manipulated, of course. Mm-hmm. And that's my concern. I think with the diversity thing, a lot of times it feels like it's a manipulation. I know I've just thrown a shit ton at you, and I apologize.
No, I love that, Dove. And I love that you're sharing that, because this is the feeling that a lot of people have that don't feel comfortable enough to share. But you have to share that in order to have the conversation. So when I have people that are, courageous enough to say that thing that so many people think, what I share is that when I talk about diversity, right? Diversity as a word is becoming a little bit stale. People are tired of that word. Mm-hmm. But I try to re-engage them by saying, when I talk about diversity, everyone thinks immediately of race and gender. Mm-hmm. But it's also lived experience. It's also personality. It's also disability, age, things like that. So it's more encompassing than just the boxes of race and gender. And then I get the question all the time, we want to hire more diverse candidates. We know that we should, right? It's expected. But we also want to hire the most qualified candidate. And the recommendation that I make is, what happens is a lot of times your diverse candidates get filtered out early. Make sure that those top 4 candidates that you're really interviewing, really seriously considering, have diversity in the mix, and then pick the most qualified one. What happens a lot of times is the diverse candidates, again, get filtered out too early. Yes. And you're not waiting for them to rise to that interview level where they're real serious considerations. They want to go ahead and wrap it up higher. And I get it. Like when you're behind in a role and you're, losing momentum for that position that's vacant, you want to fill it, but don't be so eager to fill it until you've got some diversity in that level. Then pick the most qualified one. Sometimes it's going to be your diverse candidate, sometimes not. And that's okay. But that's the way that I recommend that our clients do their hiring to ensure diversity at that serious level. And then best candidate wins. And you will start to grow your diversity doing it that way and keep the best candidates first.
Yeah, I think that, I think that you're absolutely right in that there's no doubt there's been racism and there's no doubt there is racism, and anybody who denies that is an idiot. I'm sorry. He's just, that's all it's, and racism is not a white thing. It's a thing. It's a human thing. We've done it forever. I'm married to a brown girl, and I remember fighting with her mother because her mother was telling her brother that he shouldn't be out playing golf so much because he was getting too dark. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? And he's like, I like the sun. Right. Well, because white is right. White is better. Well, that's a social conditioning, and it's actually not from white people. This is part of the thing. If you look at the history of it, of course, there was the colonizations and all the horrible things that especially us, the British white did, right? But at the same time, that was going on before in China, for instance. Royals, high prestige people did not go out in the sun, and so if you were paler, it meant you had more wealth and status. So there's all kinds of things with it, and of course we understand all that. But the piece of it that I like that you just brought up here is for us to pay attention to not just race, but the conditioned biases you don't know you have. This is the key. And so many years ago, I talked about this is when singles were first going online. And I said, let's do a singles app. And the idea of it is you cannot see the person's face until you've had 4 conversations. Mm-hmm. Because we're filtering out by mugshots.
That's right.
And let's face it, sometimes the person's not putting up a real photograph anyway, and you've removed somebody. Mm-hmm. So for me, and I talked about this with a company I worked with years ago, which I said, I want you to make sure that there's somebody, and it must be somebody junior who takes every application that comes in and whites out the name. Mm-hmm. They keep the name, but you don't. So you don't see names.
Yeah.
You don't see any names. So if the name's Jamal and you unconsciously, because you're a decent person, but unconsciously you've already created an image, it's gone. So now you're just looking at qualifications. Who is this person? Mm-hmm. And to me, that is real diversity. That's real inclusion, because I'm including you no matter what. But, you're clearly not qualified. See ya. Oh, your name's Chad? All right. Well, I don't care. Your name's Jamal? I don't care. It doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. Am I on the track here?
Absolutely, Dov. And that's exactly to my point about that those resumes get filtered out too early. Right. And that's exactly on point with what I was saying earlier. That bias exists. And unfortunately, we all have bias and it's unconscious. It's baked in, things that we've heard and how we've been socialized from children. Yeah. And we can't eliminate it. We can only manage it, be aware of it, do the things necessary to mitigate it. And so we do have reactions based on gender, based on race, based on the address that appears on that resume, right? Yep. So it's lots of things based on the schools that are on the resume. And so there are a few things that I recommend doing. One, absolutely, make sure you're taking those pieces of the resume off that will, trigger those biases.
Yep.
And then the second thing is, and I'll use myself for an example. I'm from New York. My parents are from Pittsburgh. If I see a candidate from Pittsburgh, I'm going to talk about what neighborhood, did you go to these restaurants, right? And half of the conversation is about our, shared, habits, hobbies, locations, hometowns. And the other half is spent on, are you qualified for the job? And a lot of people do that, right? And myself included. So I recommend using rubrics to make sure you're comparing evenly across. And then there's some time left in the conversation for those, personal pieces of a conversation and an interview. But you've got the information that you need to compare evenly. Because if I spend the whole time, and this has happened in my past stuff, this is a real situation. I spent 3/4 of the interview talking, but we went to the same school. I was talking about Tampa, and did you have, go to Busch Gardens, and where did you live? And that person was great. I thought they were amazing. But were they qualified? I'm not really sure, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I liked them.
So many, right? And whether it's, that specifically, but that's how we process information and interrelate. And it's not, unusual. It's not anything different than any of us do. That's part of how we are.
That's how we build rapport.
Correct. But, to create some equity, especially in hiring and promotions and things like that, we've got to be able to filter that out and rubrics and things like that are a good way to do that. Also, have other people in the interview. So if you were in the interview with me, you're going to say, hey, Jackie, we've been talking about, Pittsburgh or USF for a little bit too long. Let's move back into some other thing. And that's helpful.
So everything you just said, everything about it makes sense. It's easy to understand. And I think all of us can go, yeah, I think I'm pretty good at that, but maybe I could be better. Okay.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
But now let's get down to the nitty gritty, which is that DEI is bloody exhausting. It's just exhausting because it feels like I don't know the right words. I don't know the right thing. And in many ways, it seems to have gotten out of hand. It seems to have gotten kind of crazy. Mm-hmm. You and I had a conversation about this last time we spoke off recording. Yep. That I saw a conversation between you and your partner, and you were talking about white papers. And I'm like, oh my God, I want to fricking scream because a white paper is no longer allowed to be a white paper. What the hell is that? Like, that is nuts, right? Yeah. There are things that have a color that are not related to a race. It's a white paper. What does that mean? It means it's blank.
Right. And it's on white paper.
It's on white paper, but I can't call it a white paper anymore because it is. So there's these things. How do we, I know that you deal with this directly. How do we deal with this? How do we deal with this extreme? I'm going to come to it in a minute, but we'll start with it. How do we deal with this extreme fragility around people who are walking around on freaking eggshells? That doesn't create bonds. That doesn't connect us. We may have a very diverse group of people we've employed, but everybody's going, I'm not sure if I can say this. Can I say white paper? Oh my God. Oh, you're a CEO, chief operating officer. Oh, it's a chief. Is that offensive to Native Americans? It's just too much. My opinion. Not the truth.
No, I absolutely hear you. And, so there's two pieces of that, Dove, from my perspective. One, I think there's a lot of, well, can we say this? Can we do this? Can we say this? So I'll address that in the second part. But the first part is, a lot of people say, why is everyone so sensitive, right? On the one hand, people aren't necessarily more sensitive than they have been before. They're just more outspoken about it.
Sure.
What happens is it makes the people that have said things that are, taken negative or make people feel bad, make them feel unsafe. They're the ones committing the microaggression. So now they're uncomfortable because they're being called out. So there's that real piece that is now being called out. And it's not that people are more sensitive. They're just more outspoken about it. Mm-hmm. But there is the other side, which is, white papers, and it's totally fine to say white papers. It's a document on white paper, but it's, something like that. And one of the things that we talk about in the Inclusive Language Handbook is not to use, imagery negatively. So, when we watched old Westerns, the cowboy in the black hat was the bad guy and the white hat was the good guy. So anytime that you're associating black with negative or dark with negative, that's something that should be reconsidered. But white, so like, I'll give an example. Black ball should be maybe deny list, something like that, because it's negative. But white paper, no, it's on white paper. It's just factual. Mm-hmm. So the question is right? There's so many things that we say and have said as, children, that we continue to say that we really don't consider the question of where does this phrase come from?
Right.
Because there are some phrases that are associated with historical things that we're just not paying attention to, negative things that we never really considered. That's when we want to ask questions, but not everything is bad. I'm never going to say the word white. That's terrible, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the oversensitive piece. It's okay to take a second and consider, where does this phrase come from? I never really thought about that. And then maybe look into it a little bit. And then just be open to learning and growing. There are many words that I have said my whole life that I'm working out of, one of which being from the Northeast is guys, right? So I would say, hi, guys. That's not a very inclusive term. It took me a while to work out of that, but I say everyone or team or all or something like that. I mentioned Pittsburgh, so I'll say yins is totally inclusive. Y'all, I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina, so that's inclusive. So there are more inclusive terms that you want to use to make sure that people feel included in what you're saying and in your conversations, especially if you're a leader or a public speaker.
But at the same time, to push back again, is there's always somebody in the room who can be offended by something. Mm-hmm. And this is when it becomes crazy. Mm-hmm. And this is when people get upset, right? Yeah. You and I talked about when Andrew Yang was called out because he wasn't offended by a comment about Chinese. And he's like, I wasn't offended by it. Mm-hmm. So why are you offended for me?
Yeah.
You're even white and you're offended for me? Mm-hmm. Hello, Karen. All right, come on. I mean, this is silliness. It's gotten silliness. So I think you have the right to be offended. I just don't think you have the right to ask anybody to change because of it. But you do have the right, and you should have the right to voice that being offended. Right. You don't have the right to expect me to change because of it. And a lot of times, you said something here that I think is really important. We don't bother to, it's right there above my head. We don't bother to be curious about something. We need to be curious. And that curiosity is not one-sided, folks. So this is something I want you to understand. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to be curious about things that might be racist that you're saying that you probably never thought of as racist, there were gollywogs on the front of my marmalade jar in England when I was a kid. Right. And so we called, and they were black dolls. Right. And so we called black people wogs. Okay. And then I moved to Australia, and wogs were not black people. They were Italians and Portuguese and Southern Europeans. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So maybe we just need to get rid of the word. All right. So we get rid of the word. Fine. Okay. Now we come to how you want to ask a deeper question. So for instance, I'm going to use this one, because most people have never even considered this. Let's look at Ebonics, right? And this language that, we ax instead of ask, right? We ax. All right. As we say, well, that's a dialect. Okay. Is it? And is it black? Well, actually, it's not. Mm-hmm. It's not. It's from the West Country of England. That's where that comes from. That dialect that is Ebonics comes from the Devon, Cornwall area of England, and it comes from the poor people who moved to southern United States. And so it actually is white. You're claiming Ebonics is black, but it's actually white. It belongs to Cornwall and places like that, which was a bit sort of, they're not famous for being the brightest people, right? And again, it's a bias, but it was a categorization of people. And mostly because they didn't get educated, they were poor. So a lot of these things we don't bother to think a bit deeper about. We don't bother to, I'm just using that as an example, not as something we should go after, but to understand that a lot of the time we're claiming something as a white person or as a black person, as if it's like sacred, when it's not. It's bullshit, right? So we're claiming it as sacred acts. No, it's not. I get to say acts. It's part of my. No, it's not. I get to say this because I'm a whitey. No, it's not. It's just bullshit that you made up. And let's, one of the things the reason I want to have the conversation with you, Jackie, that I liked about you is it's about honoring human beings and being respectful. That's right. But without craziness. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of, on both sides there, of craziness. that we've got to just back off from. And how do I love and respect and honor you without being on, as I said, being on eggshells?
Yeah. And I totally agree with you. And curious is important. And I totally agree there. Stay curious is so important because it's a continual state. It's a continual set of questions. It's a continual set of dialogues with people so that you can understand different perspectives and what makes them feel seen and feel valued and feel honored and respected, and what makes them feel bad, feel not empowered, feel not valuable, right? And in that conversation or in that environment. And so having those conversations is so important. And right, you've got people claiming things without understanding the history of it. And that's part of, with inclusive language, understanding more of the history of the words that we say, the phrases that we use. Where does that come from? Is that something that I should be saying? And, the thing about it is, Dove, we're also going to mess up, right? We're also going to revert back to something that I've said since I was a child. And it's just a matter of growing, learning, practicing, trying to be better. A lot of times you hear the conversation about cancel culture. And generally people, you will hear those single call outs, but people in general don't often cancel over one mistake unless that one mistake is egregious, right? And some of the words that I'm talking about, and intended to demean and demoralize. But one of the examples that I really like to use is Lizzo had a non-inclusive word in one of her songs. She acknowledged it, she apologized, and she changed the song. She corrected it. And so her fans were, and she's, someone that likes to empower, expand the definition of beauty. And, she's great, but she made a mistake, right?
Yes.
And it was about acknowledging it, apologizing it, and correcting it. And once that's done, I think people in general, not everyone, right? Because there's always going to be that outlier, will say, okay, keep moving forward, keep growing.
Yeah,
and
but look at Kevin Hart. I mean, he apologized hundreds of times about his gay jokes that were 11 years old when he was going to do the Oscars, and they didn't let him go. Right? They just didn't let him go, and he apologized up the yin yang. Right? I'm a Chappelle fan. I love Dave Chappelle, and I love I think he's great. His social commentary is really great. But coming back to Kevin Hart, he apologized, and when is it enough? Right? Because there are some people who were never going to let go. So when you say Lizzo apologized and it was done,
I think, and certainly I get it, and people should have the opportunity to grow, right? And I think the backlash was around Kevin Hart making, joke after joke, not a single joke.
It was part of his repertoire 11 years before about gay people. Yeah.
But people are entitled. We do have to give people room to learn and grow and expand, right? If you're held accountable, right? If we think about how we were, Dove, as teenagers and the decisions we made, right? And we can't be held to that same standard. So I think we do need to give people space to learn and grow. And, I'm always a fan of people that are saying, you know what, this is how I thought. Talk to me about how I could think differently about this. Yes. And I'm always open to those conversations.
Of course.
And so I think more people should be.
So we're at the end of part one of the show here. And I want, of course it's flown by, which is great. And I want to make sure that in part two, I want to talk about appropriation. I want to talk about fragility, particularly. I mentioned that in the first part here, and whether we are facilitating fragility. I want to talk about those kinds of things. And of course, I want to talk about how do we maneuver language, because that's what your book is about, language.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about those things in part 2. But before we do, I want to make sure that people know where they can find out more about you and all the wonderful things that you do in your book, of course. So please, would you share with our audience how to find out more about you, maybe bringing you in, or how people can grab a hold of your book?
Absolutely. You can find me, connect with me by going to thediversitymovement.com. And you can find information about the book and order the book at theinclusivelanguagehandbook.com.
Fabulous. As I said, we'll make sure that we post all of those in the show notes.
Awesome.
We're going to be back for part 2 of our delicious conversation with Jackie Ferguson. In just one click, you'll just go click, and there you'll be, right? And so stay tuned and stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about how you can be a little more inclusive and a little more diverse, even in your own thinking and your own biases. We'll be back in just one click. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.